differently? Do you want to start, Margaret?
Yeah, I'll start. I just got the recording in progress prompt, so I got a little distracted.
Me too.
Hi, everyone. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you, Rebecca, for moderating for us, and Diane for kind of handling us in this Zoom space. Yeah, I guess, I could say I became an artist. I can remember the day I went to the Art Institute of Chicago and stood in front of a Van Gogh painting. And I was probably all of in 6th grade, maybe even younger. And I remember looking at that painting and thinking, I could do that. This is making me feel something. This is really interesting what it's conveying. I love the tactile quality of how Van Gogh painted. And, and then I just kind of pursued that through my different levels of education. And how, I guess, for me, I've also had this very strong interest in kind of theory and reading, and how those interests then impact what I make work about. I always feel, I guess, not even in the past tense, but I always feel that as an artist, I need to have content, right? Like content is, I have to feel passionate about something and be interested in something. And because I like theory and I like researching, that's the tact I take into making work. And so, having met my colleagues here in the Endpoint Collective through a program called Trans Art Institute, we all were in that path of researching, making work. And I found that, in my practice of collage and photo-based collage, I really found that it lent itself to dealing with things like post-human discussions of gender, post-human discussions of environment. And what I mean by post-human is just this idea of kind of non-hierarchical equality of being, whether it be human or non-human. So, I mean, that's really my entry, and I'll kind of leave it there and let others jump in. Deborah, you want to go?
For me, in terms of entryway into art, I'm going to date myself now. 1967, Expo 67 at the American Pavilion, they had a Helen Frankenthaler hanging, this enormous one hanging at the top of an escalator. And I remember coming up the escalator, I was 7. And when I got off, I was transfixed. And that same idea of like, I want to make that. I want to make things like that. It had never occurred to me before that was possible. And, then life. And so I started going through I've always had a variety of interests in science and psychology and other things. And so I ended up getting a degree in psychology and community development and wending my way through until I was finally in science. And then from science, I went into art. So I sort of did the long route and ended up wanting to know more. As a scientist, what I was interested in was the general. I wasn't so interested in the micro of things. I wanted to know the story, the narratives behind things. I wanted to know what made things tick, why we were the way we were, why the earth was the way it was, and how do all of these things come together and work together. So growing up, I also had the advantage of access to the Laurentians, the Laurentian Mountains, and spent a lot of every moment I could up in our country place where it was pretty isolated. There were only 2 log houses on the lake. There was no running water. There was no electricity. It was perfect. It's still my idea of a perfect place. And so for me, art became this way of melding my interest that has always been there about ecology and how we can take care of the earth, how we can present the earth, how we can look at more closely at who we are, where we are, and how we function in these places. And I think that's, for me, how I start to examine things coming through.
Thank you. You want to go ahead, Mark?
Yeah, I think that I don't remember when I decided to become an artist. I think I just assumed that that's how one lives. I remember being very curious about the natural world and climbing trees and running to the fullest extent of my body, and riding bikes and looking at small creatures and or flocks of birds. And I think like those initial like moments of undifferentiated rapture in the environment, that's what propelled me on the art trajectory. I remember my initial visit to the main library in Dayton, Ohio, where I was initiated to seeing the abstract expressionist painters. And it felt like being immersed in another form of nature. And I'm like, this is a world that I can inhabit, and this is an entry point to something beyond my imagining. And one thing that I think is very like relevant to start with this question around this topic of climate change is because I keep returning to these early moments of initiation, because they are like the truly most tender enthusiasms of my heart. And that seems like a very important thing to have an open conduit when dealing with things as heavy and as challenging as climate change.
I totally agree. What about you, Gabriel? You're still muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think I was really fortunate in having my parents be very much appreciating the value of the arts and nurturing that in me, setting me up with private art lessons with a really great artist at a young age. Visiting her studio and working with her there was, I think, a really formative experience. Seeing the artist's studio in a very genuine way at a young age, and working there was really exciting and inspiring. My father is a horticulturalist, so I grew up on like a nursery, and at times he managed organic farms, and he was really into watercolors and pastels, and big Monet fan. And so I got a lot of formative experiences of just really being affected by natural beauty. And and we'd be going for a drive, and he'd pull over because it was such a beautiful sunset, and do a little watercolor or something like that. And so that was kind of a part of my childhood, and had a big effect. Yeah, and that's carried on. I think like Mark was saying, I grew up, the nursery that I grew up on was bordering the foothills in Colorado, and so it was just sort of kind of a natural playground. And that's just spent my childhood running around and biking around and in nature, and that's just sort of carried forward into my work.
Great, thank you. What you were saying, Mark, about tapping into sort of that initial joy and wonder is exactly where I was hoping to go with this question. That I really feel like one of the things that's so important for us is being able to hold on to that wonder as we're thinking about climate change and issues, different social issues. It's pretty heavy out there right now, and so trying to still have amazement. And I'm curious if there are pieces that any of you would like to highlight from from this collection that tap into some of that sort of curiosity and wonder.
I mean, well, I'm happy to do that. Diane, if you could bring up the yellow paintings on my set, that is Aurora. And I explicitly was attempting to paint the most like amazing thing I could imagine, which was the Aurora Borealis. So to depict being in contact with entity or energy that's streaming across the universe and is making ever-changing, evolving imagery. It's just like mind-blowing. So that was the subject of this painting. I was aiming just to go for awe as an element to connect one, and also as a palliative to the disjunct. And just because, we're still alive, the sun has not hit peak sun. So that's always important to keep in mind, because I have yet to discover the utility in fatalism.
Thank you. Are there others of you who'd like to share a piece related to that idea?
I'll jump in just real quickly. If Diane, if you could go to they're like sketches, my first couple of sketches. Yeah, right here, and then the next one. So part of this is just kind of my process and practice of how I work, but go to the next one, please, Diane. Yeah, so I am a big science fiction nerd, and I really enjoy, the idea of speculative fiction and the problem solving that kind of comes out of that. And for me, I guess that wonder and that kind of joy comes from the unknown, perhaps space, perhaps, the possibility of aliens, all of that, that comes out of my youth in a lot of ways. But as I think about the work that I'm doing and creating what I call the Chimera Portrait series, I am thinking about how, if you look at like this, little sketch, how, nature kind of constructed or merging, being sewn into that idea of science. These are kind of just these are like sketchbook pages, how I'm thinking things through, and how the butterfly then perhaps merges with the human eye. And, and it's just questions. It's like asking questions, what are the possibilities? And for me, as we were talking about, this kind of heaviness of climate change, it's not necessarily something I want to dwell on. And I think most people don't want to dwell on it. But when I ask questions, I want there to be, whether they're, I guess possible or not, I want there to be solutions perhaps, and just to keep asking those questions. For me, that's the wonder, like, is the curiosity, the curiosity in our environment, the curiosity in our environment and life. So.
Thank you. So I think that, well, I guess first, Gabriel or Deborah, do either of you want to jump in, or can I go on to my next question?
Go ahead.
Okay, great.
I jump in on that one if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Why don't you bring up the light box one?
Yeah.
If you can find it there. Yeah. Because I feel like my work is always dealing with that sense of wonder with nature, and I just gravitate towards landscape work, just 'cause I feel like when I'm working with a subject, whether it's from memory or photography or in person or a combination. It's a way of sort of attuning or communing a bit with that sense of wonder, and through sort of filtering it, through my eyes and my hands and everything. It's sort of a way of processing it. And so for me, that's really a powerful way of being attuned to nature and spending time with it, especially with images, spending time with an image and a memory, that was just a small moment, but you can really spend some time. And then there's the baggage that is just, I think at this point in time, maybe somebody's more better at mindfulness or something than I am, but there's just always this background noise and weight of all of the just all of the context. it's inescapable, and so I feel like I'm continually trying to balance that state of wonder and sort of aesthetic experience of the beauty of nature with the historical baggage and current contexts and terrifying speculation and curiosity and all of the rest of it together. And so yeah, I think that state of wonder is really important, because without it, I think that what's the point, and especially working with young people, it's hard to imagine not having the kind of immersion in nature that I've experienced in my upbringing, and then to have the current context that we're in, which, to be fair, were the same context as when I was a kid. I was, as a kid, I think the formative stuff of my work is being in nature and hearing about a hole in the ozone layer, and wondering, like, what the hell is that? Like, is all of the air going to get sucked out of it? And that's been a constant background for my whole life, and certainly nothing has gotten better.
Yeah. So why don't we go there? I think this question of, one thing I am really interested in is, I think that one thing that our society really doesn't do well is face grief and loss and trauma. And I think that there are ways that art can really help us process loss in different ways, and that's really necessary to be able to move forward. And I'm curious if there are pieces that any of you have here that are speaking to grief, and or think Deborah, I'd love to hear from you a little bit. I know you referred to some stolastalgia, but things are changing constantly, even if there wasn't climate change, that would always be the case. But that's hard for us humans, and I feel like art can help sometimes.
I think what it helps to do is process. One of the things I'm interested in that's tied very much to memory is this idea of witnessing things. If something is witnessed, it's less likely to be forgotten. How do we attach memory to ideas and places, things, people? How do we do all of this, and what can it mean? And sort of in looking at the other than human, what kind of form can their memories take? How are these memories expressed? How can we look for them? Can we speak for them? And how do we allow them to speak for themselves? So these are some of the questions that I think about when I'm trying to process things in my work. And it doesn't mean that it has to be extremely disconnected from other things. For example, Diane, can you bring up the T-Rex, please? It sounds very ominous, doesn't it? Bring up the T-Rex, but like,
My 5-year-old would be very excited though.
So one of the things with this is that everyone that usually engages with the photography, and I use photography at the beginning of my process. It's one of the ways that I sort of capture things that I see that I want to sort of say, this is what I see in the moment before I've even started to get through how I feel about all of it and so on. And so with these, I saw these emerging from the snow. They were plastic toys that were coming up through the snow. And I found them after I'd been to, I'd given a talk to a group of scientists at the Natural History Museum. And we were talking about large ideas and how can you, embrace grief? How can you express what the Anthropocene is? How can, is anybody ever going to get the Anthropocene? Because it's such, we're talking about an epoch and it's a large idea. And so here I am, and I was actually on my way to visit Mark, and I come across these dinosaurs across the street in a park emerging from the snow. And they hit me because who doesn't like a dinosaur, really? And also, even the title of it, Allegory for a New Ice Age, is it seemed to capture perfectly what we were talking about. Here are these objects, which are fun to look at. And you can look at, Diane, could you go to the next slide, please? So they were, and this is how I found them. I didn't move them. I didn't manipulate them. It was as they existed, as they emerged. And the thing is, with the Anthropocene, one of the things we talked about is one of the basic definitions is that it is the way in which humans have fundamentally altered, right, our geophysical space. That's basically what we've left our imprint. And these items are made of plastic, and yet they're part of the problem, but in the same way, this was a way of showing it that can allow people to see, have an entryway in through humor, which doesn't always happen. It's certainly not the same with all my pieces. Diane, can you show the bird, please? The bird pieces for me came from a way of witnessing what happened in a space. There's a space this is in Germany, and it's known as the Reisenfeld, and it's like the sewage fields that are there that are very toxic. And so they've remediated the land and have brought back as much as they can to it. And there are these birds that you would normally hear down there. You would normally hear them everywhere. And certainly when you look, it's pastoral, you see all kinds of birds and animals, but there's some missing. And what I wanted to do was find a way to capture them. This is a corn bunting. This is the way that you would often see a corn bunting perch. And on the text around these tondos, which I had made to sort of evoke the idea of a nest, a safe place, is all of the calls and the mnemonics of how they would sound. So in a way, it's finding another way of witnessing in a very different way from the photographs, but sort of a next step down of how can I witness that? How can I communicate what that would be like and what could be missed? And a way, it's an entryway, as the other one was a sort of humor and an entryway in, this is an entryway into grief, in a sense. It's an entryway into memory and absence. And I think that's how I sort of see these pieces. So it's a way of memorialization in a way that allows people hopefully to process.
I love that. That's really interesting and really neat. Are there other folks who want to jump in and sort of ways that you've been exploring grief or loss with your work?
I could speak to extinction and how that plays with the Blob Squatch series that is in the gallery. So Diane, there are the 5 paintings that are square there. So I, for a long time, worked around the Pleistocene extinction because, like my tender self, young self, felt the absence in the landscape of like, why isn't there a mastodon here in Ohio where I was raised? So I think like that kind of grief persists and is like universal. It's like, it's part of the ill-ease that we feel. We miss things that we're not exactly clear what we might be missing. And the Blob Squatches, this series in the gallery, I dealt with Sasquatch because I think that Sasquatch or Bigfoot is actually an extinction prophylactic in a way, that Bigfoot emerges when nature is in peril. And then this creature that is like us, situated in primordial nature, appears so that we can have an enhanced sense of sympathy for the landscape. And this is exactly how it transpired when Bigfoot emerged in like our current epic, like in 1967, when they were cutting old growth forests in Northern California. Sasquatch emerged. Like, we put ourselves into the landscape. So my paintings are kind of using humor a little bit, like Deborah was saying, in that like I went and searched for Bigfoot in art history and paintings in the Met, and faithfully reproduce these blurry prospects of primordial nature in the art environment, in the art ecosystem, staring back at us.
Oh, that's
Can I jump
really
in there
interesting.
really quick?
Yeah, please.
Just small note, where I just recently moved from Bella Bella, British Columbia, and Health territory, and the piece that was painted in the light box there, the claw or Sasquatch or Bigfoot is very much real and present and not extinct, and so it's really interesting. I've been meaning to actually mention this to you. I don't know how we've never talked about this, but I'd constantly hear about people who had seen the claw, had seen footprints, had smelt it. It had a very distinctive smell, and that it was very much a current, present, live creature. So if that might make you feel pretty good. Except that the story is of the claw is that if that it has a basket, and it comes and takes children who don't do good listening. Anyway, just thought I'd jump in and add that.
Thank you. Yeah, so sort of thinking about children who don't do good listening. No, just kidding. Thinking about the idea of ways that we've influenced our environment and their environment, putting ourselves in our environment, and vice versa. I'm curious, how you're seeing different issues, broader issues intersecting with climate change and with your practice. And, if there are ways that those things are interplaying for you.
I might jump in, and in a way, it's going to relate back to also our previous question. But Diane, if you could bring up the large three-figure chimeric, like, yeah, here. So these are the Chimera portraits, and I guess, for me, that intersection, I mentioned this kind of relationship to the field of science fiction, but I really started kind of looking, asking myself the question, like, what is happening to humans? What is happening both, scientifically? What are people studying in terms of genetics? What is happening as the environment, what is the environmental impact on us? And I don't know if it's, I can't say it's humor, and I can't say that it's fear. I think the chimeric portraits kind of come from that tradition of almost like Frankenstein, where they could be seen as monstrous, but they could also be seen as beautiful. There's that nice little push and pull for me that I'm really interested in. And it's that notion of transformation of, of humanity that I'm hoping to get at in the work. And when you were asking, I was thinking about the Sasquatch and about the blob squatches and, that kind of situated, I think about my work primarily focused on the body because I come from a place of working with gender historically through my artwork and, what it means for gender maybe to be neutral or to be expansive, right? Instead of binary. And I think that that's my feeling about these large issues of climate changes. I'm on that precipice of, we should have enough technology. We should be hopeful that we can solve these problems. But then I'm also afraid of our technology and I'm afraid of what we are capable of. And so it's that not knowing, it's that speculation, and it could go to a very dark place or it could go to a very hopeful place. And I guess that's why I create the work I do. That's where, for me, the artwork kind of intersects with all of those fields of science and science fiction and, perhaps anthropology and other fields that inform us, about what our impact is in the climate or in the world. Diane, can you go to Claire's quote? It's the last quote I put up. So one of the things, like as we were having that conversation, I think it's not that one. I think it's the last one in the group. It has 2 paragraphs. I'm going to bring it up so I can read it because I've made you guys very small. But what I'm thinking about when I say all of that and in this idea of being between those, hope and despair is, I think Claire writes very eloquently about that in our catalog, where she's talking about uncertainty, death, despair, yet we're still here alive and surrounded by life, love, and other beings. And then she kind of ends it, the kind of article on this idea of, humanity being confronted with its own limits. The Tower of Babel is falling, but new life will rise from the ashes. And, for me, again, that just perfectly embodies how I'm thinking about my art, my place for art within this, kind of conversation, the larger conversation of climate exchange and our conversation within our collective. So.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think, again, one of the things that art can do so powerfully, I feel, is, on the one hand, really helping us process things that are hard to understand. And on the other, imagine things that we wouldn't have been able to wrap our minds around. And I'm curious how others are thinking about imagination and possibility in your work.
Well, I'm seeing like increasing like utility for the imagination, especially as aspects of the broader environment lose their functionality or expire, that our imagination can be a respite or can like fill in the gap. So I think it's important to keep like a vital internal expansive ecosystem in the imagination as a response and as like a redoubt.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, Gabriel?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to jump back to what Margaret was saying and Deborah as well, about the role that art plays, and it has to do with the imagination, but it also has to do with memory and witness. Is that the artwork, it serves as, for us as the artist, as processing, and hopefully has that for the audiences as well, but it also has a witnessing role in that we are witnessing our time, and through our unique perspectives, and that's a record, and that's one of the most important roles of art, I think, is to really show for future generations and to look at in retrospect, what was this, how did this person perceive what was going on in their time and place. And so I do a lot of imagining of, what the world will be like, of course, as we all do. And it's terrifying and exciting and bewildering. And I think, it's a lot of grief about what, maybe what the world will be like for my children. And, talking with my partner about that. And, she made a really good point of, well, that's your experience. For them, it's just going to be the reality that they live in, right? And I thought that was a really important thing to remember, is what's right, this is our bell. So students are going to start coming up. Anyway, yeah, to keep in mind our our experience versus the experience of the people who are going to be coming after us. This is going to be their only, right? And it's very different depending on where people are coming from and what their experience is. But that what we are doing as artists is our own personal record. And yeah, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's really that really resonates with me. And I think, figuring out how to continue to cultivate the curiosity and wonder, regardless, will be really important. So we've got about 15 minutes left. I have a couple more questions, but I'm sure that there are some folks in the audience who might have some questions as well. So if you do, I invite you to put them in the chat. And I'm opening the floor for that. But I'm going to go ahead with some more of mine as well, while we see if there's anybody if there are any others that people would like to contribute. So, as you were saying, Gabriel, there's this sort of individual, witnessing and marking, but there's also such a interplay between artists and an audience and others. And I'm curious how you all think about partnering with scientists and activists and, your audience to engage and move toward action. What are the ways that you've really been thinking about influence and yeah, moving toward action?
I know for myself and my practice, I engage with scientists and environmentalists, wildlife biologists in a number of ways on an ongoing basis at almost every part of my process, because I'm not an expert. And so when I become interested in a topic, then what I want to do is I want to speak to those people who are equally as passionate about their work and what they see it as part of their environment. And I become excited to hear what their narrative is in describing it to me. It can be anything from, I work a lot also with sound and create graphic scores. So if you could show my last slide. In creating this work, where I looked at a tree that had been cut down, it had lived for about 100 years. It was a sugar maple. I worked with horticulturalists on the property. I worked with the bottom part of that tondo is actually a cross section of that tree on which is mapped all of the data that I got from different scientists. Whether, so on the blues are actually data that I received from meteorologists. The data in the center came primarily from arborists and dendrochronologists, who are the people that read the lines, literally read the rings. This piece is called Reading Between the Lines. And the third one dealt with pollution. So in that I spoke with urban planners who could tell me what to expect during that time, as well as historians, because this was about this tree, this 100-year-old history of the tree and all of the things that it could tell us, that it witnessed and could reflect back to us. So I wanted to speak to as many people as possible about all of those things. And in speaking to all of these people, I managed to put together a history that could then be interpreted sonically. And actually you can hear the sonic representation on my website through the QR code at the gallery. So, you know, for me, it's an absolute integral part to speak to everyone, the groundskeeper, whomever. I mean, and these guys can tell you I'll talk to anyone. So it's about all kinds of things. I am tangent woman. So it's how I can bring them in and engage them in different ways. And sometimes people aren't so happy to be engaged. Like sometimes I'll show up at a lab and if the guy will have been told by the department head that he has to talk to me, and you'll walk in and you'll see the eyes roll. And, you know, I also accept that. So if they tell me I have to go brush up on calculus and physics, then respect that and learn some of their language or some of their entryways in to respect what others have to say, regardless of who they are. Everybody has a story.
Yeah,
It's really interesting. Thanks for sharing the background on this piece. Sorry, go ahead, Margaret.
No, I was going to jump in after that because I think it's, well, I can test the fact that Deborah can talk to anyone. So we'll start there, but I appreciate that. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, I think as an artist, I first make art for myself. I'll be honest, you know, it's like I'm processing, I'm dealing with what I want to investigate. It's in a way, it's somewhat selfish in that part, but then I want to share that work, you know, and I think it is the sharing that is the point of action for me. It's that conversation. And you know, there's a lot of things that have been written about art and climate change and activism and questioning the value of it. Does it promote change? Does it do? But I think having these conversations are a point of action. Having them larger, you know, a larger conversation with our audience at the gallery. But I also am myself very interested in the conversations we as a collective have, because we're able to push each other to new ideas, to think about, you know, all of our work in new ways and perhaps then influence another audience in a future exhibition. You know, and it changes, and it's, I was also kind of reading what somebody wrote in the chat about, you know, this idea of, you know, our capacity to hold sadness. You know, we kind of touched on that earlier with, you know, this idea of grief. It is a lot to be an artist and to be able to give an audience member a moment of respite where they're questioning, thinking about these larger questions and being able to see it in a non-verbal, a visual way. I think that is action, you know? So that's kind of my feeling of the place of arts. I also teach. I mean, I'm going to come to that too. It's like I teach. And so being able to bring up the topic, I did my photo workshop on climate change, and my students made amazing work. They're, you know, they are the next generation, and the way they're thinking about things, and they taught me, you know, so there are these conversations happening through the arts. So.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, thank you for your comment, Mary. I thought that was beautiful. Mark or Gabriel, how are you thinking about your work and moving to action and collaborating with partners?
Well, I think that sometimes the collaboration is very clear, and sometimes it's more just things sort of in dialogue, whether they really even know it or not. But in terms of relationships between science and the arts, I think that having grown up with gone through ever since lower elementary, doing recycling drives and all that kind of stuff, and then learning later that was really just basically a cover for the plastic industry, and it's really easy to be super jaded, and I think that the science and where art can really help is when you start to understand that the science and the numbers and the graphs and all of that hasn't really made a whole lot of difference. We know, I mean, most people, know what's going on at least some broad level, and know that the planet is suffering, and know that it is because of us, and know that's threatening everything. And yet we continue, so I think for the arts, we play a really important role in, I think, helping people, back to processing, not just processing what is going on, but how it affects us. And I think that's a really important role for the arts and humanities to play. And if science is going to tell us what's happening and why, we still have to deal with that. And if we're not dealing with it, then there is no action. And so I think that that's really important. And I think that there will be my real hope, as I think is in naming things is so important. When I became aware of the term Anthropocene, which I think Mark actually introduced me to, I think it was really exciting and empowering and validating to have all of a sudden, something to really gather a lot of feelings and opinions and research around that felt just too big and all over the place. And my hope is that naming becomes official, because until it does, it's not really taught. And I'm here, in the classroom. I've got my students here now, so I have to go pretty soon. But the thing that I the most hope in is the naming of the thing, and that by naming it, we will have to basically reframe the entire way that we teach human history. And if we don't, it will be grossly inaccurate. And so it's going to be a great boon for research and textbook sales and everything, as it's all recalled and revised to ultimately frame, huge swaths of human history as a horrendous failure, and to reflect on that and process that grief and look at where what went wrong, and for that to happen on a large scale will inevitably require a lot of collaboration.
Yeah, totally. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I'd like to continue that thought. Well, I think that it's going to take everybody, like, in all of our unique points of view, and that's why we're here, to give our unique take on things. And what I think is happening in a larger sense in the collaboration between science and art is that we're forming a story. To me, science and art are technologies that are storytelling technologies. And this is incredibly relevant for our particular moment, because like in the Pleistocene, when humanity left Africa and spread across the globe, every new piece of land that we arrived upon resulted in an extinction. I actually can't even think of an exception. And what's happening now is the entire planet is changing. So we're all collectively moving into a new environment. So we're in that really risky position that humanity encountered during the end of the Pleistocene. All of the societies that then adapted after the extinction event did so successfully by having a really strong place-based story. A great example would be the indigenous population of Australia, like ostensibly one of the most successful civilizations outside of Africa, who have a story that is like down to like individual elements in the environment. It's wedded. Like the Dogon people in what's now Mali have a similar kind of situated place-based story that like is cosmic, literally. And that's what I think is happening between science and art. We're working to make a place-based story as fast as we can with everyone involved to get us through this hurdle.
Well, I feel like that's a great note to end on. Thank you all so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. As someone said in the chat, so many resonant points that also resonates with me. I really enjoyed talking with all of you. And thank you all so much to our audience for joining us this evening. And I hope you'll get to go see the show in person as well. And, you know, along these lines, of course, I hope everyone will vote. The election is coming up. Yeah, Diane, do you have any final words for us?
I would just like to, again, thank everyone for coming. It's been a really amazing conversation, and thank all of our participants for being willing to share their art and lives and feelings with us. It's not always an easy conversation to have, so I'm so excited we were able to have it this evening. Our next event this month is coming up October 26th. Claudia Spiro, who is our project space, will be doing an event about her show. So look for publicity for that coming soon. And have a great evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everyone.
Thank you.